Aloha. So we made it to week 7. I wanted to wait until we got a little bit into the week, so I'm posting this Tuesday night or maybe even Wednesday morning. I apologize. But anyways, we cover a lot of information, and I teach these classes with the idea that I'm hoping to answer some questions for some of the people that are interested in assessment. The reality is, in almost every context, we know from what we've read and also through our own life experiences that assessment is integral and instrumental and ingrained, embedded, and all these other great M's in every facet of what we do from pre-kindergarten on, in terms of the gold stars for achievement, in terms of social promotion as well as academic promotion, qualifying for honor roll. I mean, it's just everywhere we go. Anyways, the class rolls back around into this week looking a little bit more at the construction of tests, and it might be a little tricky in terms of why don't we look at some of those things at the front end. But really, I think the benefit of doing it like this is, now that we've looked at intelligence, we've looked at personality, projective and subjective, we've looked at career, we look a little bit at the forensic capacity, we look at a little bit at the adaptive and neurological capacity. Now I want to start looking at really the idea of how do we construct a test for anything, whether it's intelligence. Well, we'll stick with intelligence for a second, because we know from our postings and certainly from our intelligence project, people struggle with the notion that we can actually identify and certainly quantify what an IQ is. And one of the things that I really tried to emphasize in as much capacity as possible in my responses to you guys on Yellow Dig, as well as my response to some of the questions that I've gotten, is think about assessment as specifically geared towards answering a referral question. The referral questions I get, they're very, very assessment answered specific, meaning, is this person competent to stand trial? Is this person have the capacity to be held accountable or culpable for a crime? Is this person learning disabled? Is this person cognitively disabled? Is this somebody that, based on their personality and sometimes IQ, certainly adaptive, are they the best fit or the best placement or the best setting for a child in a custody battle? There are a lot of kinds of contexts that we look at when we try to answer the question of what are we assessing, and ultimately what's that answer going to generate. There are times in the forensic capacity where the evaluation's results, that profile that gets generated, it can be the difference between someone getting early release or being denied parole. It could be the decision making between getting put on death row or being executed. It can be the decision of, is someone going to have supervised custody, or are they going to have full custody or no custody? It can be the difference between, even though there's a disability, and I gave that example of a surgeon, even though there's a disability identified, is it great enough that that person can't, and I use quotations, and I do this a lot, I know you guys probably see it in my references, but can they have gainful employment? The cardiothoracic surgeon, the neurosurgeon, they can't return after an accident to that level of care, that level of profession, but they still are a general practitioner, so they can still generate income. They can still work in the capacity of a doctor. They're just not making anywhere close to what they used to, but do they qualify for disability? Now, what I want to do is look a little bit at some of the parameters of what do we need to look at when we're trying to design a test. Now, we saw in the initial video for the class, we saw the ideas of, we need to make sure it's content. Back up. We need to know that it's valid. It measures what it says it's going to measure. We need to know that it's reliable, that each time you measure it or each time you administer it, you get fairly consistent results. That's the place where IQ has the greatest strength, is when I assess someone in 3rd grade, I assess them again in sixth grade, I assess them again in ninth grade, and even in 12th grade. And we see that the IQ doesn't tend to vary much. In fact, that standard range of error is about 5 to 7 points up or down. It really doesn't move more than that from 5 years old to 18 years old. It's fairly reliable. So when we're trying to think, what are we wanting to assess? What do we want the results of the test to tell us? When I put up clinical interview, I talked a little bit about it being a diagnostic instrument. And so the way that a clinical interview was created, that instrument, it took the DSM and it said, okay, if we want to look at depression, if we want to look at psychosis, if we want to look at anxiety disorder, if we want to look at a substance abuse disorder, if we want to look at dementia, if we want to look at personality disorders like borderline and histrionic and all those sometimes very, very crippling underlying pathologies, we need to figure out an instrument that's not only going to ask those questions, like depression, is there a change in eating, is there a change in sleeping, weight gain, weight loss, loss of pleasure in previously pleasurable activities, suicidality, flat affect, lethargic. Not only those. See, the instrument can't just ask those questions, because there are things that can happen to the endocrine system, there are things that can happen to the hippocampus with arousal, there are things that can happen to the reticular formation, which is essentially the operator that decides what part of your brain gets neural activity when there's an incident or a stimuli. I need to make sure that instrument also rules out what it's not. And that's the place where we find a lot of these instruments fall flat. There's a couple databases. One's called the Mental Measurement Database, and essentially that really lists quite a few instruments across the gamut. But when you look at the strength of an instrument for correlation coefficient, for content and face validity, for inter-rater reliability, we see that for IQ, there's really only about 4 instruments. The Wechsler instruments, the differential instruments, and then there's some of the nonverbal, like the unit and the C-Tony. But out of all the IQ tests, there's really only 4 that are recognized. When we look at personality, and we're talking about the empirical nature of measuring and developing a personality profile, we've got the MMPI, we've got the MCMI. Other than those 2, for objective personality, there's others, but my question always is, why did you not use the one that is the best standardized, strong, empirical, scientific-based instrument? So even though you can go online and take all these tests, the ones that are recognized as having validity, reliability, higher correlations to the referral question and answering the question are very limited. Same with neurological. We've got the Luria, Nebraska, we've got the Halsted-Rattan, we've got the NIPSI, we've got the Brief. That's it. There are other instruments, but they're fairly narrow when we start talking about the strength of the instrument to answer the question. So a lot of times the referral question is going to drive the instruments you use, but the standard battery, and I've been doing this for about 17 years, and my standard battery in almost every single context, forensic, learning disability, physical cognitive disability, custody, we're looking at, if it's an adult, we're looking at the WAIS, Wechsler's Adult Intelligence Scale. We're looking at the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. We're looking at, depending on the nature of the question, we could look at a projective, we could have a sentence completion, we could have a draw person. We're doing a mental status exam. We don't necessarily have to do a clinical interview unless there's concerns about mental illness and we're trying to find something diagnostic, because the reality is, and the MMPI can really give me quite a few insights on diagnostic types of criteria as they're being met or at least manifesting. But the profile is generated from a fairly narrow toolbox. And that's because There are a lot of instruments that do similar things to the Wechsler's adult intelligence scale or the differential ability scale, but these instruments, they do it well. They've done it for a long time. They've been standardized across a lot of different personality types and psychological types and cognitive level types, and to answer a lot of referral questions. So when we're looking at how do we determine why another instrument, let's actually ask that question. What instruments, and one of the things in the project is, what are these instruments missing? So if we're looking at an IQ test, what is this test missing? If we're looking at a personality test, what is missing? So a lot of the emphasis, and I certainly know that I subscribe to trait theory quite a bit in some of our trait assessments, only in the realm of there is so much psychological baggage that we all have. And historically, there are so many things that shaped who we've become. My goal is to take who you are now. I can't make a relationship to who you were, and I certainly can't say that you're who you are now because you were abused, because we see a high percentage of people that are abused don't become pathological. A high percentage of people that are raised in alcoholic families don't become alcoholics. A high percentage of individuals that are sexually molested don't ever sexually molest. So even though we can draw relevance to they were neglected, it was an impoverished environment, they weren't nourished educationally or intellectually, we can make all those connections. But when we're talking about the strength of a correlation, none of those variables, whether it's poverty, one single family, drug-riddled family, lack of access to resources, those are all very relevant. But when we're talking about generating a profile, a psychological profile, and we're talking about it being valid, reliable, and having a higher correlation coefficient, we have to take all those factors out. Because on an individual basis, you might become who you are because of that, but it's not because of that you became who you are. It's who you are, and then that impacted who you are, and you continue to evolve who you are based on those in response to those things. So there's a theory called gene environment, which essentially says you're genetically wired who you are, and then based on the way that the world interacts with you, certain parts of your personality might emerge or develop or regress or repress, but they were there already. And then the way that you become, especially right around 8 or 9, where a lot of developmental theories say you're kind of who you are. I want to know, as an instrument, what do I need to answer? And so when we're looking at the statistics, and they call it psychometrics, and that is when we're looking at the value of assessment, that's really where we want to go. So let's talk about test development. We've got to conceptualize, what are we looking for? What specific traits? What attributes? How do we find it? Like if I want to know about analytical thinking or sequential reasoning or pattern recognition or visual spatial skills, I have to get a task that validly measures that, as well as doesn't measure something else that could contribute to that. The place that becomes really relevant, especially when we look at IQ, is what's called expressive and receptive language skills. We see that without intact ability to understand instruction and without the ability to express what you know in a way that explains it and demonstrates the mastery or the proficiency of what you know, you can't do it. And so you might actually score very low on an IQ test and be brilliant simply because you don't know how to express the relationship between a cat and a dog, a fork and a spoon. So I need to make sure that this instrument not only identifies what it's looking for, but identifies very specific skills and subsets and subtests that can give me a picture of that skill. The other part I got to know is, how am I going to standardize it? Now, usually an instrument is standardized by increasing n. The more I administer it, the more my number of examinees is, the better chance I have of finding the patterns. The MMPI is the best example of this. It's been applied to tens of millions of people. And through that, you can look at pattern construction of the individual that is has the profile of an officer, military, police, FBI, the profile of a deviant, the profile of someone that struggles with gender identity, the profile of someone that is clinically depressed, the profile of someone that is psychotic. We start seeing enough over those tens of millions to say that there's a prevalence of these specific characteristics being correlated with these types of pathologies. And so when we talk about standardizing, that's the goal. Standardizing is the reliability and the validity and that strength of the correlation. And then the last part of a test is, or that construction is, how do I make sure it tells me what it's not? And so I'm teaching a forensic class, and in that it's in a forensic assessment class. And in that class, we're looking at juveniles. And so we've got three really, really predominant diagnoses that go along with juveniles. We've got ADHD or ADD. We've got oppositional defiant. We've got conduct disorder. And so conduct disorder and oppositional defiant are fairly similar, but there are instruments that are specific to measuring those pathologies. And so when we look at conduct disorder, you have impulsivity, you have impaired judgment, you have difficulties sustaining attention. When you look at ADHD, you have impulsivity, you have difficulty sustaining attention, you have difficulties with sequential reasoning, and so they might look the same. But what we notice is the way that impulsivity manifests in ADHD is much different than the impulsivity in conduct disorder or oppositional defiance. So what the instruments are, and I'm going to show you one in a second, but the instrument's goal is, how do I identify its ADHD while also ruling out that it's not oppositional defiant? Because we do see something called comorbidity, and I referenced that in one of the discussions. But comorbidity is essentially dual diagnoses. It's two things that could coexist. And so when we look at conduct disorder, there can be a prevalence of individuals also having ADHD. And when we look at oppositional defiant, there can be a comorbidity or coexistence of ADHD. Now, you don't have ADHD, you don't have oppositional defiant and conduct, because those are actually the same diagnosis and they're age-related. So oppositional defiant is when you start getting to early adolescence, and then as you move into early adulthood, we have conduct disorder, and then at adulthood, those people, a high percentage of them graduate to what we call antisocial personality disorder. And so I have an instrument, it's called the BASC, and we use it in a lot of contexts, but this instrument's goal is to, let's get it pretty, okay, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And so it asks a lot of questions. Is easy to please. Never, sometimes, often, always. Now we know about the Likert scales. So the thing that's interesting on the Likert scale, and what's really relevant here is, never doesn't mean it's never ever happened. It could mean it happens so rarely that you wouldn't say it happens enough. Sometimes, I usually say, is about 10 to 15% of the time, often is about 50% of the time, and always is about 75% of the time. Now, what's interesting is, and what we need to keep in context is, I give this to an individual. Now, this instrument, it's called the BASC, Behavior Assessment Scale for Children. And its goal, and it goes all the way up to 22, so or 21 actually, we have it go up into college age, but this thing is going to look at a lot of different areas, and it does it through, let's start asking specific questions, Now, the instrument itself doesn't have one purpose other than generating an overall profile similar to the MMPI of the student, of the individual. This is a primary instrument in most of the states that I do some work, especially around educational and emotional disabilities in the education system. This is one of the highly recognized instruments. So, easy to please, pays attention, refuses to talk, overly active, argues when denied way, congratulates others when good things happen, terms in work, irritable, avoids making friends, fearful, aggressive. So it goes across a whole gamut of things. And we can't take into consideration that the teacher or the parent or the caretaker or the organization leader, whoever the service provider is, we can't take into account, there's nowhere in here to take into account that they're exhausted. This teacher's been putting up with this kid for 6 weeks. They disrupt instruction, they blur it out, they're rude to other kids, they're breaking pencils, they're moving around the room. So there's nowhere on here that accounts for the teacher's exhausted. I need to know that this is one instrument, and it's truly a subjective instrument that's giving me the perspective of the caretaker or the service provider, but I also have to interview and assess the kid individually to see where we see connections and correlations. But there's 165 questions on this test, and this one is the teacher's rating. So the teachers are going to fill this out. They're going to answer every one of these questions, and then after we score it, we'll get to one of these profiles here. So after we score it, what happens is every single thing that we're going to measure comes up. So not only is it going to look at hyperactivity, anxiety, depression, somatization is a lot of physical complaints, headaches, stomach aches. Atypicality, which is acting a little bizarre, doesn't always mean psychosis, but there are questions in there about sees things other kids don't see, hears things other kids don't hear. Then there's a lot of questions about adaptive. He transitions well, adapts to change well, is able to move from one task to another. There's questions around socialization, tends to like to work alone versus work with other kids. There's a barrage of questions. And so when you start looking at the kinds of things that come up, we've got negative emotionality. Now what's nice is it's going to tell you every question that measures emotional negativity or negative emotionality. It's going to tell you what questions on that test gave you the answer, and it tells you how you responded. So argues when denied own way, he never argues. Although he's sometimes irritable, he doesn't find fault with everything. He's not really negative about things that often. He doesn't react negative. So this isn't going to be endorsed by any stretch. Then when we look at the next one, resiliency, finds ways to solve problems, works well under pressure, transitions well, has good coping skills. It starts looking at the specific, what we call resiliency, but attributes, that trait theory. So as it goes on, it tells you ADHD probable, autism probable. So they're endorsements. Do they have enough characteristics to say that they meet the criteria of autism? Now, that doesn't mean we label them autistic. It just means now we might want to administer a specific autism evaluation. Or if they have atypicality elevated, which is that one that's quirky, eccentric, sometimes psychotic, we might want to do something that measures reality testing. The goal of this test is not to diagnose, but to come up with ideas of what kind of things are they struggling with. Emotional control, executive functioning, behavioral control. I mean, you can see that it just looks at so many aspects. Aggression, anxiety, attention problems. Here's that atypicality. Has strange ideas, seems out of touch with reality, picks on things. So the instrument isn't diagnostic. It doesn't claim to answer what clinical diagnosis does the client have or the student have. What it claims is it is a screener. It is an instrument that creates red flags that then precipitates me going deeper into looking at questions around emotional regulation, executive functioning like planning, inhibition control. It gives me directions to look at. The other part that's relevant to this is it doesn't claim that never has strange ideas means they're normal. It really provides an opportunity to look at it in the context of each teacher that does it, each parent that does it, how do they rate? And then I can compare them. So the results of this is a graph. And in that graph, I'm going to have everyone that filled it out, they're going to have data points on that graph. And so I'm going to have hyperactivity, I'm going to have depression, I'm going to have anxiety. And so one puts them, we're going to call this the at-risk range. We're going to call this the clinical range. And so the student, how they rate, one teacher puts them here, one teacher puts them here, one teacher puts them here, another teacher put the depression down here. So I start getting profiles, and one of the things I'm looking for, which makes a lot of sense, is disabilities aren't situation specific. So if someone has a disability, if they have a pathology, it's not going to be in math class, they can't understand what you say, understand it. Doesn't mean they can't learn math. There are math disabilities that prevent them from understanding it. But what I'm talking about is if someone has a cognitive disability, they don't have it in one class and not another. If they have emotional disability, they don't regulate in one and not in another. The place that this has the most relevance is ADHD. We see that diagnosis thrown across so many places. And the struggle with it is that if you are ADHD, you essentially shouldn't be able to regulate. Oh, let me get that off real quick. I'm going to pause this for 1 second. So with ADHD, across the gamut, you're going to see one teacher says that he literally can't sit still. He doesn't finish any of his work. He blurts out. He's impulsive. He's fidgety. And then another teacher says, oh my gosh, the whole time he's engaged. He's sitting in the front. He's just absorbing information. So we could say, well, it's a high interest versus low interest. But with ADHD, it's not a regulatory thing. So when I have these parents, and one of the questions I'll ask them is, tell me about your child playing video games. The ADHD kid can sit in front of a video game for 10 hours. The kid that's not ADHD can sit in front of a video game for 10 hours. If I want to use video games as a rule out, the student with ADHD is not staying alive for 10 hours. He's dying repeatedly because he's impulsive in the way that he plays. The kid that's not ADHD, he can maintain, he learns and remembers where everything is in the, I'm always thinking of like the Call of Duties and stuff, but he remembers where everything is. He works collaboratively with other kids. They survive and achieve and succeed. The ADHD kid, he can't maintain because even when he's highly interested, ADHD interferes. And so when we look at the types of instruments that we use across the gamut in psychology, one of the things I just want to emphasize is, remember, when you're looking at it, the results, always say, what was the referral question? What were they trying to answer? How well did they pick the right tools to answer it? And how well did they answer it with the profile that was generated? Anyways, I really enjoyed the class, guys. I hope to see you again in another one of my classes. I teach a lot at the graduate level, so if you end up going on to master's and doctorate, you'll probably be in one of the classes where I actually teach you how to do these assessment instruments, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know you guys more. Have a great semester and certainly a great summer.